With the basics in mind, let's now take a brief summary tour of the key points from across the lectures. In the lecture on economic growth, Malcolm Childress highlighted that there is a strong basis in economic theory about the importance of land tenure and property rights, and a growing body of increasingly rigorous empirical evidence about productivity and investment, about sustainable land use and other impacts of secure land tenure. The evolution of land tenure and property rights is closely linked to economic history and philosophies, from tribal to feudal to capitalist and socialist ideologies. And what will we see in the future? Land tenure and property rights are not static. Economic models are not static. They evolve, and we need to be cognizant of that. For sustainable and inclusive growth, there are many benefits to establishing effective systems of land governance. Rights and responsibilities are clearly defined. Tenure is secure for the right duration for a particular use and can be transferred at reasonable cost in relation to value. Records are transparent, and disputes can be resolved in cost-effective and fair manners, thereby underlying strong economic growth. In the lecture on food security, Thomas Jane highlighted how improving tenure security could significantly raise food production and decrease poverty in Africa. Recall the evidence from the introduction and from the economic growth module. Research from places like Ethiopia, Uganda, and Burkina Faso is showing the link between smallholder productivity and land tenure and property rights in Africa. In Tanzania, a study showed how women earn significantly more in communities that allow them to own land. The time is now to pay attention to land tenure and property rights to achieve food security in Africa, as Tom Jane told us, and I add, around the world, by the way. Land policy is not just about land rights, but also about how land access through public or private transfers happen and the implications for the agricultural economy. Jane provided an example of the medium-sized commercially oriented farms emerging and asked whether this will allow for inclusive development or whether it is, in fact, local speculation, another form of land grabbing. The same inattention to land tenure and property rights underpins land markets, by the way, and largely leaves space for land grabs, whether they are by domestic parties or international investment. And again, contextualizing that these investors may be doing good, but the weaknesses in the systems allow results that are not optimal for either party. Improving land governance should be part of a strategy to address the looming population growth, migration, and job creation challenges in Africa that come together to create food security. In the lecture on urban development, William Valletta highlighted that urban tenure, in fact, emerges as rural land uses are converted to urban land uses, and new forms of tenure become needed. Like in rural areas, there is a continuum of tenure types at play in most urban environments. Interestingly, Bill Valletta made a parallel to the tension in rural areas between formal statutory law and customary law, using the term neo-customary and suggesting that in urban neighborhoods there are informal rules of the game at play: community witness of rights, non-state actors governing access to land, and neighborhood associations that mitigate rights and responsibilities among people. As in rural contexts, there's no ubiquitous recipe for securing land rights and administering land records efficiently. Context matters. Two modes of urbanization and corresponding tenure patterns were highlighted. First, formal urbanization that occurs through planned developments and the corresponding tenure types, such as contracts, administrative certificates, and property rights through private transfers. Second, informal urbanization that happens via unplanned settlement and development. This is the neo-customary model context. And there we may also see contracts, but they will be informal, and there are quasi-administrative permissions that are awarded. In the lecture on land disputes and peace building, Maureen Lemke illustrates the panoply of land tenure and property rights issues and their interaction with other development challenges, and how they have left behind a trail of land disputes seeded by complex and diverse causes, and they create a need for integrated approaches to the resolution and prevention of conflict. Basic good land governance is foundational to achieving peace. Maureen Lemke cites the following criteria: equity, accountability, integrity, transparency, and effectiveness as key attributes of good governance. These are the basic principles behind and elaborated upon in the voluntary guidelines for the responsible governance of tenure of land, forests, and fisheries that we discussed in the introduction and that you heard about in other lectures, and also behind the World Bank's Land Governance Assessment Framework. In the lecture on climate change, Mark Freudenberg illustrates how people's usage of land and natural resources, water, mineral, and trees, for example, affects directly and via climate change impacts the quality and sustainability of land uses. Changes in water availability, soil fertility, erosion, deforestation all contribute to migration and further overuse of existing resources. Relative scarcity and increased value can increase conflict among uses and users. The quality of land tenure and property rights can make matters better or worse. Tenure systems need to respond, aligning incentives across actors in the near term and for the long term. Applying the principles of good land governance will help. In the lecture about disasters, Cynthia Karen points out how attention to land tenure and property rights helps us address the underlying causes of vulnerability that exacerbate disaster and slow down recovery. Attention to land tenure and property rights helps make institutions and communities better able to recover and plan for disaster. It promotes resiliency. Land tenure and property rights should be part of contingency planning. In the wake of disaster, we can't fix the land tenure and property system fully, but we can take measures to facilitate and not hinder reconstruction while jumpstarting better land tenure and property rights for the longer run. The Haiti case study illustrated that disaster causes displacement, and reconstruction after disaster involves relocation, resettlement, and shelter and other infrastructure investment, and these can be complicated by a lack of information about pre-disaster tenure and sometimes by a literal erosion of boundaries or registry records. A prior disaster, Hurricane Jeanne in Haiti, showed how hillside deforestation, for example, is partly attributable to poor land tenure and property rights, and how it exacerbated the impacts of a hurricane as a wall of water rolled down the denuded hillsides, affecting homes, businesses, and even public offices such as the property registry. In the lecture on gender, Cheryl Doss informed us that women have less access to land and weaker rights over land. Improving women's access to land and strengthening their rights positively affects multiple dimensions of economic development and poverty reduction. Gender considerations should be integrated across the full project lifecycle, from assessment before design to implementation planning, and then to monitoring and results measurement. Good measurement will allow us to document the evidence and to understand what works and does not work. This infographic, which was presented in the introduction, tells us that there is an accumulating body of evidence behind the points that Professor Doss made. The example on prosperity comes from Tanzania, which was one of your case studies, and it was mentioned in a food security review because, again, as I said, it documented how women's earnings ability were 3 times higher in communities that had allowed them to access land rights, and the implications of that for families being able to acquire food. The evidence on safety, for example, freedom from domestic violence, on education and health, might be less intuitive, but in fact there is a growing body of evidence that demonstrate these, and they're linked to land tenure. In the lecture on human rights, Tiernan Menon highlighted that historically property rights have been included, but in a limited way. He cited the United States Bill of Rights, for example, and he moved forward to more recent conventions, including the voluntary guidelines that I just referred to. Today, monitoring and enforcement mechanisms are emerging. For example, international human rights courts and special tribunals. The Columbia Restitution Commission is a current example. In practice, there's still a long way to go to reduce human rights abuses and issues that happen in the context of poor land governance. But on the positive side, there is increasing attention to human rights in the discourse about land rights and conversely. Corporate governance and standards are starting to emerge. If you recall the human rights examples from the module related to large-scale acquisition of land, we can also know that that is not just something that happened in Ethiopia and the other examples given, but happens around the globe. National Geographic, for example, published an article on Mozambique with a compelling storyline showing the devastating effects of that for poor people. Corporate governance and standards are also emerging. For example, Coca-Cola and Pepsi have recently announced zero-tolerance commitments for land grabbing, of the sort that you saw in the Ethiopia example in Professor Menon's lecture. Colombia has another interesting example. A social impact corporation called Equitable Origins recently certified Pacific Rubiales Energy. Several sites were totaling 250,000 hectares, which produce 25% of Colombia's oil, are now certified in terms of good practice behaviors around the rights and livelihoods of the communities where the oil is being extracted. Equitable Origins is now incorporating a standard around land rights into their certification process. Learning is ongoing about restitution and the return of rights of internally displaced people, and progress is being made in how to establish strong land tenure and property rights systems that will reduce the opportunity for these kinds of problems to emerge. In the lecture on land administration systems, Grenville Barnes defined land administration as the administrative structures of governments that serve as a repository of up-to-date information about tenure and the location of land and other real property. To date, these systems have primarily focused on ownership rights and the encumbrances that go with them. This is changing as many different types of rights, including rights of use and access, are starting to be recorded in kinds of land information systems. Tribal governments, for example, can also manage land records. Customary land secretariats in Ghana, for example, are developing and managing their own local land administration systems. We need organized information on land tenure and property rights as a basis for efficient transactions, for taxation and valuation, and for resolving land disputes. An unresolved challenge within land administration systems reform is how to create such record systems so that they are accessible, responsive to the needs of all land users, transparent, and financially sustainable. In the past, high cost have led to unsustainable attempts and a reversion of rights that were formally recorded to informal status. The Haiti lecture highlighted these types of issues and challenges and what are being done about them. Finally, in the lecture on monitoring and evaluation, Mercedes Stickler conveyed that monitoring and evaluation matters for learning and for accountability. It's important to set indicators and targets to actively monitor project performance against plans, and also to track project risks. We can identify special concerns such as unintended negative consequences on the land rights of vulnerable people, and this can allow adaptive management along the project lifecycle. It's important to identify questions that can be answered by rigorous impact evaluation and integrate an approach to evaluation into project plans ex ante, ahead of time. Project team and evaluators must then work closely together as the project is implemented and changes happen to ensure that the evaluation design can also adapt and still provide for learning. Indicators and targets and evaluation questions should be grounded in a theory of change that tells us in the context, in the development domain, whether it's economic growth or climate change, etc., how will the intervention on land tenure and property rights make a difference to the outcomes, whether they're economic or social or environmental. Remember that nuance and definitions matter a lot in formulating monitoring and evaluation approaches.